ready to have a true, open, honest discussion about this whole Nolan Wells case? Huh? Okay, let's do it. What if Nolan had looked like this? What if he had been a white boy? You think for a second would not been handcuffed the motherfucking second they brought that phone back to that mama? Think for a second every major fucking influencer in the world would have been jumping on board on this, saying something's fishy about this? Because he's black, it's different. You don't believe me? Okay, let's do this real quick. Since July 4th, how many videos of these teen takeover mobs have you seen that look like this? Or this? And how many have you seen that look like this? I bet not a fucking lot. Simple fucking fact of the matter is, media, in particular, social fucking media, wants to paint the black community as a bunch of fucking wild animals. So that when situations like the Nolan Wells situations occurs, nobody gives a fuck. Well, you know what? That's why in my bio here it says champion for motherfucking all. I don't give a fuck about your race. I don't care who you fuck. I don't care about your politics. And I don't give a fuck about the color of your skin. Something about this case is fucking fishy. Something is off. And even if those boys didn't do it themselves, stop calling them his fucking friends, because they left that young man on the island with fucking strangers and he never came home. That's the bottom fucking line. Don't you dare tell me that if Nolan had looked like this right here, things would not have been handled differently, because they abso-fucking-lutely would have. Those of you in my comment section saying, don't make this about fucking race, pull your fucking head out of your ass and wake the fuck up until you admit that people of all colors are treated fucking differently in this country. Specifically when it comes to shit like what happened to Nolan Wells, you will always be a part of the fucking problem and not a part of the fucking solution.
They killed Nolan Wells on the boat. They covered him up with the life jackets. They all knew he was on the boat. They just laid him on the back of the boat and got towed in part of the way. Then they got their boat running and they got on in. And when they got in, they couldn't figure out where they were going to put him or what they were going to do. So they dropped everybody off. Then they went back out to the island that the GPS doesn't show, but they did, because they disconnected it. Okay? And none of them had their phones with them when they went back. So there wasn't any trace of them going back. And they dumped the body. They came back, took the boat out of the water, then went over there at 3 a.m. and washed the boat, thinking washing the boat would get all the DNA and everything off the boat.
Now, after you've listened to it, I'm sure that you got the same thing that I have. I don't think that he's describing what happened, or like if he had firsthand knowledge of what happened and things of that nature. I think what he is doing is saying that this is what he heard on one of the panel's lives or something of that nature. And he is saying that these content creators, TikTok creators, we are the best investigators out there, and that the police or investigators, or if there are any in this case, should look into the things that we have researched, because he feels that we're spot on.
There's a photograph that nearly 1 million people watched get taken apart, frame by frame, in a single night. It shows an 18-year-old boy standing in a pool, laughing, surrounded by friends. For a few days in July, that photograph was treated online as proof that Nolan Wells was alive after the night he supposedly drowned. People built entire theories on top of it. Some of those theories are still circulating right now. As you watch this, the photograph was taken 8 days before he died. That's the story we're telling today. Not just what happened to Nolan Wells on a barrier island off the Mississippi coast on the 4th of July, But what happened after? Because in the weeks since his body was found, this case has split into two competing versions of itself. One version lives in Sheriff's Department statements, GPS logs, and grand jury filings. The other lives in comment sections, in duet TikToks, in screenshots that get reposted faster than anyone can check where they came from. Both versions claim to be chasing the truth. Only one of them is actually built to survive contact with it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly where the real evidence stands, exactly which viral claims have already fallen apart under basic scrutiny, and exactly what is still genuinely, legitimately unanswered. Because there's a difference between a mystery and a rumor mill, and this case has become both at the same time. Let's start with who Nolan Wells actually was, before he was a hashtag. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for exactly this reason, to separate what's actually been confirmed from what just sounds convincing at 2 in the morning. If that's the kind of coverage you want more of, hit subscribe now, because we're going to be tracking every real development in this case as it happens, not just the viral moments. All right, let's get into it. Ocean Springs, Mississippi sits on the Gulf Coast, a few miles from Biloxi, the kind of town where everybody's kid seems to know everybody else's kid. Nolan Xavier Wells grew up there. He graduated from Ocean Springs High School and moved on to Southwest Mississippi Community College, where he played wide receiver for the football team. He was 18 years old. People who knew him described the same handful of things over and over. He was social. He was the kind of person who could walk into a group of strangers and have a conversation going within a few minutes. His mother, Christine Wansley, has talked publicly about the night before he left for the holiday. She cooked salmon for dinner, and before he headed out to spend the night with friends ahead of the 4th, he told her, "Hey, Mom, I'm about to go. I love you." A hug, a kiss, and he left. That's the last time she saw her son in person. Friends described him as big-hearted, someone who never met a stranger. He was the kind of kid who'd walk up to his mother while she was getting ready for bed just to ask her to take one more picture of him. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, and we'll come back to it because it becomes one of the more disputed threads in this entire case. On July 4th, 2026, Nolan traveled out to Horn Island with a group of friends. Horn Island is a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, part of the Gulf Islands National Seashore. There's no development out there, no buildings, no cell towers worth relying on, no lifeguards. You can only reach it by private boat, and on a holiday weekend, it fills up with exactly the kind of crowd you'd expect. Coolers music, boats anchored close together, groups of teenagers and 20-somethings spread across the sand. Nolan was last seen, by every account given so far, sometime around 3 o'clock that afternoon, near the island's northwest tip. He was wearing blue swim trunks and sunglasses. He'd spent the day socializing, and according to friends, he'd been talking with a young woman he'd met that day. Sometime after that, the accounts started to diverge, and that divergence is the entire case. Before we get into that divergence, it's worth walking through exactly how the search for Nolan unfolded hour by hour, because the scale of it tells you something about how seriously it was eventually taken, even if the very first public statement from the sheriff's office undersold that seriousness. One of Nolan's friends contacted the Coast Guard directly from the water at approximately 11 o'clock that night, not the following morning, that same night. According to reporting from Capital B News, there was a gap of several hours between that initial contact and when the Jackson County Sheriff's Office formally requested Coast Guard assistance and coordinated a search, which didn't happen until around noon the next day. That gap, between a friend calling for help at 11 at night and a coordinated search beginning around midday, is itself one of the quieter, less discussed details in this case, and is a legitimate procedural question independent of anything involving the friend group's own account of that afternoon. Once the search did formally begin, it involved the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the United States Coast Guard, the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, and the National Park Service. Since Horn Island falls under the Gulf Islands National Seashore and is technically federal land, volunteer search and rescue organizations, including the United Cajun Navy, joined as well. On July 6th, a National Park Service ranger recovered Nolan's body in the water off the island's northwestern tip. It's worth noting, because it's come up repeatedly in coverage of this case, that Horn Island sits on federal land, which is part why the FBI has since become involved in an advisory and forensic capacity, working alongside Jackson County investigators. Sheriff Ledbetter has confirmed this contact publicly, while being careful to clarify that it does not represent a federal takeover of the case. Jackson County remains the lead investigating agency. FBI involvement in a case like this typically means access to more advanced digital forensics capability, recovering deleted data, verifying metadata on photos and videos, and cross-referencing witness statements against phone records with tools a smaller county department may not have in-house. That's a meaningful addition of resources. It is not, by itself, an indication that federal investigators have reached any particular conclusion about what happened. Here's what's been established through witness accounts, official statements, and now public GPS data pulled from the boat itself. According to friends who were with him, Nolan's group encountered a mechanical problem. The boat he'd arrived on developed an issue with its bilge pump, the pump responsible for clearing water that gets into the hull. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, the boat began taking on water. The group made the decision to head back to the mainland. Nolan did not go with them. According to the account given by his friends to investigators and to media, Nolan told the group he intended to stay behind and catch a ride back later, possibly with the young woman he'd been talking with, or with another boat in the larger group's flotilla. His phone stayed behind with the group, left on the boat's dashboard, according to one friend's account, along with roughly a dozen other phones belonging to people who didn't want to risk water damage. At around 11 o'clock that night, one of Nolan's friends contacted the Coast Guard. Sometime after that, Christine Wansley reported her son missing to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. What followed was a search involving the Sheriff's Office, the Coast Guard, the Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service, and volunteer groups, including the United Cajun Navy. On July 6th, a National Park Service ranger found Nolan's body in the water off the island's northwestern tip, the same general area where he'd last been seen 2 days earlier. He was identified through dental records, not a visual identification, not a family confirmation, dental records, which is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about the condition in which he was found, even without going into further detail. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office initially stated there was no indication a crime had occurred. Sheriff John Ledbetter told reporters at the time that there was no information suggesting foul play, and the county coroner indicated there were no immediately obvious signs of physical trauma. For a lot of families, that would have been close to the end of the story. A tragic accident, a drowning, a search that ended the worst possible way but with no further questions attached to it. That is not what happened here. Christine and Elmore Wansley did not accept the initial framing, and once you walk through what they were dealing with in those first days, it's not hard to understand why. Start with the phone. Nolan's phone did not stay on Horn Island. According to Christine, she and her family used a location tracking app Life 360 to find it, and the phone was showing up back on the mainland in the possession of one of Nolan's friends. Not lost, not left behind in the chaos of an emergency. Sitting with someone who had returned safely, while Nolan had not. When the family finally got the phone back, Christine says she and her sister went through it, specifically the Snapchat app, since that's the platform Nolan used constantly. What they found, according to her own account, was nothing. No saved photos, no snaps from July 4th. This is despite Christine describing her son as someone who documented everything. Parties, hangouts, even asking her for one more photo before bed. A silent Snapchat account, on the one day everyone agrees something significant happened, is the kind of detail that doesn't need embellishment to raise a legitimate question.
This guy lied during the interview with Brendan Tatum, and not only did he lie, the lie he told is extremely problematic. I did a really full breakdown of this on a YouTube video if you want to go watch my complete analysis and input. He said the last time he saw Nolan Wells was 3 o'clock.
The last time I saw Nolan was 3 o'clock.
But then, like 2-3 minutes later in the interview, he's talking about how they found the boat taken on water and had to be towed out, and it was 4:30, an hour and a half past 3 o'clock. And he said this.
Nolan was sitting by the boat with that Katie girl.
So wait a minute. If the last time you saw Nolan was at 3 o'clock, then how did you know he was beside the boat with Katie McCormick at 4:30? Also, Katie McCormick's the person that they keep saying is who he said, I'm going to stay behind with. But Katie McCormick herself disputes that, and he disputes that in this same interview.
And I heard the girl that he was with, Katie, had text somebody that she heard people yelling
Correct.
for Nolan to get on it. Is that true?
And I have a picture of that. She texted my buddy, and the next day everybody was panicking and everybody's texting Katie, because she was obviously seen with Nolan the whole day at the island. Katie sent a message to my buddy the next day and said, this is the last time I saw him, he's really sweet. But she also mentioned that the last time she saw Nolan was when my buddy was yelling at him to get on the boat.
This is a red flag from hell. Anytime you're talking about the timeline of events on the day in question, especially as it pertains around the last time someone was seen alive, he says Wyatt was yelling for Nolan from the boat. Get on the boat. Get the fuck on the boat, Nolan. He says that Katie's text message confirms she saw Nolan by the boat at 4:30, and he says that Nolan was on the boat, beside the boat at 4:30. So everybody says he was beside the boat at 4:30, and then they didn't take him with them. According to them, he stayed behind, but nobody else, the thousands of people on Horn Island, saw him after 4:30. 4:30 is the last time that we saw him alive, and that's when we caught you in this lie. Not only is 3 o'clock not the last time you've seen him, according to your own contradiction, but Katie McCormick contradicts that he stayed with her. This is a major red flag. It's not just a casual deception, casual lie. It's about the last time he was seen alive. Also, this entire Brandon Tatum interview thing is completely looks scripted, edited, and polished to complete a narrative. And from all indications, he's doing it jointly with the family. So in a scripted interview that's joint with the family, a little narrative spin interview, you still have this much deception. This is a problem.
Then there's the keys. Nolan's car keys ended up in the driveway of one of his friend's homes. Not handed to the family directly, not dropped off. The family had to go retrieve them themselves, the same way they'd had to track down the phone. Then there's the clothing discrepancy. Police reports listed Wells as wearing black shorts a day he disappeared. Christine says photos shared with her by someone who was on the island that day show him in blue swim trunks. On its own, this is a kind of detail that could be a simple misremembering. People describe clothing inaccurately all the time, especially secondhand, hours or days after fact. But it's one more small thread in a case that already had more loose ends than a family in this position should reasonably have to untangle on their own. And then there's a friend group's own account of Nolan's final afternoon, which contains a contradiction that has never been resolved. According to Ben Crump, the family's attorney, one young woman on the island, later identified publicly as Katie, told the family, through her sister, that Nolan said he was heading back to the boat he'd arrived on. The friends who were on that boat say the opposite, that Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind with her. Those two accounts cannot both be true. Someone's memory of that conversation is wrong, or someone is not telling the full story. That's not an accusation against any specific person. It's simply what a direct contradiction between two first-hand accounts means, and it's exactly the kind of gap an investigation exists to close. Nolan's best friend, Javon Williams, gave an on-the-record interview to Biloxi Sun, Herald addressing this directly. He told reporters he last saw Nolan after 4 o'clock that afternoon, hanging out with a girl and other friends, and that both of them had left their phones on the boat. He also said something that cuts against the Nolan chose to stay behind, framing on its own terms. I've never known Nolan to stay back while his friends leave. He's always been a guy where if he rode with you, he's going to come back with you. That's always how he's been every single time. That's not proof of anything by itself. but as an on-the-record statement from someone Nolan's own family describes as his best friend, given to 2 separate news outlets, describing a lifelong behavioral pattern that directly contradicts the version of events being offered. That carries real weight, more than a second-hand account relayed through a family member on social media, and less than a sworn statement in a courtroom. Both things can be true. Family attorney Ben Crump, along with Reverend Al Sharpton, has stood publicly with Nolan's parents demanding transparency. At a press conference, Sharpton put it plainly, "What we've been told does not make sense." Crump has pointed to what he calls glaring contradictions: the disagreement over which boat Nolan intended aboard, the fact that his phone and keys came back without him, and the sheer number of people on that island, reportedly over 200, with apparently no one able to say definitively what happened to him in the water. None of this proves a crime occurred. It's important to say that clearly and repeat it as many times as this video needs to. What it proves is that the initial no foul play suspected framing, issued before a full investigation had actually taken place, was premature, and once a statement like that goes public, walking it back convincingly becomes much harder than getting it right the first time would have been. Quick gut check before we keep going, because I want to know who's actually following the timeline versus who's just here for the drama. If you caught the specific contradiction between Katie's account and the friend group's account, the one about who said what before Nolan supposedly chose to stay behind, drop the word contradiction in the comments. I want to see how many of you were tracking that detail, because it matters for what comes next. Here's where we shift from what people are saying to what can actually be checked. Because in the weeks after Nolan's body was recovered, 3 concrete pieces of material entered the public record, and each one tells us something the witness statements alone couldn't. NBC News obtained audio, through a public records request, of a call made to a private towing service by members of Nolan's group. In it, you can hear someone say, "We're sinking. Can y'all please come?" and a dispatcher asking whether everyone on board was accounted for and in good health. A voice responds that everyone is on board. This confirms a mechanical failure that friends had already described publicly: the bilge pump issue, the early departure from the island. It backs up the core outline of the friend group's account. What it does not do is confirm whether Nolan was physically on that boat at the moment the call was made, or whether he was already off the boat by then. The timing of that gap, between roughly 3 o'clock, when he was last seen, and 4:31 p.m., when GPS data shows the boat departing the island, is the single most important stretch of time in this entire case. And right now, nobody outside that friend group has been able to independently account for what happened inside it. CBS News obtained GPS records from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources tracking the boat's movements that day. According to that data, the vessel left its dock at approximately 9:56 in the morning, arrived at Horn Island at 11:14, departed the island at 4:31 in the afternoon, returned to its original dock, then traveled into Fort Bayou before returning to the dock again, and later that evening was towed by road to the boat owner's residence in Biloxi. This data confirms a departure time and a general route. It does not, by itself, tell us anything about what happened on the island between 3 p.m. and 4:31 p.m., the window that matters most. GPS data can confirm where a boat was. It cannot confirm what happened on the sand next to it. This is arguably the most significant procedural development in the case so far, and it's gotten less attention than it deserves. Following a meeting between the family, their attorneys, and Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath, both sides agreed that Nolan's phone would undergo what's being called a mutual inspection, meaning the family's own forensic experts and law enforcement's experts examine the device's data simultaneously, in the same room, seeing the same results at the same time. Civil rights attorney and legal analyst Tyler Bailey, speaking to Law and Crimes Jesse Weber, called this highly unusual. Under normal circumstances, a victim's family does not get to participate directly in a law enforcement forensic examination. The fact that this arrangement was reached at all tells you 2 things. First, that there was enough public and legal pressure to push the DA's office toward an unusual level of transparency. And second, that there was enough distrust already baked into this relationship that neither side was willing to accept the other's findings without direct, simultaneous access. The DA also confirmed that once the sheriff's office completes its investigation, the case will be turned over to a grand jury. It's worth being precise about what that actually means, because a lot of coverage has blurred this. A grand jury referral for an unnatural or suspicious death is, according to the DA's own office, standard procedure in Jackson County. It does not by itself mean criminal charges are coming, and it does not mean investigators have concluded a crime occurred. What it means is that a panel of citizens will eventually review whatever evidence is presented and decide whether it supports a criminal indictment. That's a serious step. It's also not a verdict, and it's not evidence of guilt for anyone. If you're finding this level of detail useful, the actual difference between GPS data and a rumor, between a grand jury referral and a guilty verdict, that's exactly the standard we hold every case to on this channel. Consider subscribing so you don't miss the next update, because the phone inspection and the toxicology results are both still pending, and we'll be covering both the moment they're confirmed. Now, we need to talk about the part of this case that has actually done the most damage to the search for real answers, the misinformation, because two separate pieces of evidence went viral in this case. Both were treated by huge numbers of people as confirmed fact, and both have since been directly contradicted by the people who were actually there. A photo began circulating that appeared to show Nolan in a pool, surrounded by a group of people, posted alongside a claim. From an account Nolan's own mother says she has never spoken to or met, that Nolan had actually made it back from Horn Island alive, attended a pool party, gotten into an altercation, and was killed and returned to the water afterward. The photo spread to hundreds of thousands of views within hours. Ben Crumb reposted it to his own Instagram, but his caption, which most people scrolled past without reading, explicitly said he did not know whether the claims attached to it were fact or rumor, and that his team was following every lead until the truth was established. Rolling Stone investigated the photo's actual origin using metadata obtained independently. The photo was taken on June 27th, 8 days before the 4th of July, at a party in Pass Christian, Mississippi. A close friend of Nolan's, Trayston Shepard, identified the people in the photo, including Nolan, and confirmed the date. Rolling Stone corroborated that date through metadata from a second, independent source. The image had simply been uploaded on July 5th as part of an unrelated photo dump, posted on July 5th, but taken on June 27th. Two completely different things that got treated as the same thing by an audience that never checked. The theory built on top of that photo, that Nolan survived the boat trip, only to die later at a party, has no supporting evidence, and its central piece of proof predates the events it was supposedly documenting by more than a week. A video circulated showing what sounded like an argument, with a voice saying, "Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing?" Ben Crump referenced this clip publicly, including on Good Morning America, saying he believed the voice belonged to Nolan. The person actually in that video is Trayston Shepard, the same friend who identified the pool photo's real date. Shepard came forward to ABC News and stated plainly, "That's the video I'm referring to, and that's me yelling." He explained he'd been in a separate, unrelated altercation with someone else entirely, and that friends had been trying to calm him down and get him off the island. Nolan is not in that recording. Crump has since acknowledged this directly in a subsequent press conference, saying that's what one witness had told his team originally, and that a different witness has since disputed it, and that going forward, his team would be more careful to frame claims as what a witness told us rather than as confirmed fact. Both of these corrections matter enormously, and here's why. The people spreading the viral version were not lying in most cases. They were reacting to genuinely disturbing-looking evidence in real time, without checking dates or asking who was actually speaking in a recording. But the effect was the same either way. Two pieces of proof that Nolan's death was more sinister than a drowning both turned out, on basic verification, to be something else entirely. And notably, Trayston Shepard, the person who corrected both records, has said publicly that he and others in the friend group have received death threats since coming forward. The person who told the truth here is the one who's now afraid. That's worth sitting with before we talk about anything else in this case. Correcting a viral rumor should not put a person in danger. It has, in this case, And that tells you something important about how far ahead of the actual facts this story has been allowed to travel. There's a third claim currently circulating that we want to name specifically because it's being repeated as though it's already confirmed. The claim that no one has drowned near Horn Island in over 6 years, presented as evidence the drowning explanation, is a cover story. As of this recording, that specific statistic has not been independently verified through any state or federal records database we could locate, and it originates from social media commentary, not from a cited public agency report. Until that number can be traced to an actual source, a coroner's office, a state records request, anything checkable, it needs to be treated as an unverified claim, not as evidence. The same standard applies to claims about an unnamed relative allegedly present on the island, who supposedly explains how the towing company was contacted so quickly. It's a claim. It is not, at this point, a documented fact. If it becomes one, we will update you. Here's a real test of whether you're actually absorbing this or just scrolling past it. Type the word debunked if you already knew, before this video, that both the pool photo and the argument video had been walked back by the people actually involved. If you didn't know that, and a lot of people genuinely don't, because the correction never travels as far as the original claim, type learned instead. I want to see the actual split because it tells us how far this misinformation has really spread.
This Nolan Wells story is eating me up, and so we're going to look at this from a media literacy standpoint because I saw some really concerning reporting today where a law enforcement official was essentially blaming Nolan for his own death.
Nolan Wells was on a boat. He left from a private dock area in the Ocean Springs area and proceeded with his friends to Horn Island.
Wells was visiting the barrier island 10 miles from the Gulf Coast, boating with friends, last seen about 3 p.m. Saturday.
They left and went back without Nolan. From what we understand, he chose to stay there.
And so I know that the word gaslighting is used and not always in the right way, but this is 10 miles off the coast on a barrier island with his friends who came back. He didn't. They had his phone. They're saying that he chose to stay. Was he supposed to swim? He had no way to call him. They left him for dead. But you have a law enforcement official saying, from what they understand, he chose to stay. He's not saying from what we've been able to determine, what we've been able to confirm and verify. He's saying from what we understand. He understands that because that's what they were told. Why is he repeating what they were told from the friends who left this man to die? Why is he repeating that on national television? Then why is a news organization that has multiple layers of producers as well as a legal and standards department allowing this to be broadcast without pushing back? I didn't even hear the word suspicious in the piece. And I am a Black mother who is at my wit's end with how this country continues to gaslight us and then expects us to stay silent. Because this is not normal. The reporter can only push back so much. So this is not about the reporter. It's about the organizations that handpick the Black faces that then go out and report these stories that are gaslighting to the American public. This is problematic. So this is how I can help by speaking up to say, hey, let's look at this critically. Let's look through a media literacy standpoint. Let's look at the information that's being presented. Let's consider why it's being presented this way, who it's coming from, what's being left out, what questions are not being answered, what questions aren't being asked. This is not okay. This is not how this story should be being reported out. This is the impact of seeing Black and brown journalists systemically laid off, fired, not renewed. Please tag some of your favorite independent journalists below, especially independent Black and brown journalists. And share this video.
If the situations were reversed, if the circumstances were reversed, and it was 3 Black boys who took a white boy out and the 3 Black boys came back and the white boy did not, it wouldn't matter that they didn't know what happened. Those 3 Black boys would have been in handcuffs. Those 3 Black boys would still be in questioning to this day. I can see the Fox News headline now, right? They would have used it as proof. See, we told you Black people were dangerous. We told you Black people were bad.
This is a part of the video I actually want you to pay the closest attention to, because it's not really about Nolan Wells specifically. It's about how a case like this one turns into what has become a genuine, sustained, multi-week online argument involving hundreds of creators, tens of thousands of comment threads, and by some accounts, 50 to 100 tips a day flowing into the family's legal team alone. It starts with a real information vacuum. In the first hours after any death like this, the actual investigators know very little. And what they do know, they're not legally or procedurally able to release yet. That silence isn't secrecy for its own sake. It's how investigations are supposed to work, protecting witness statements and evidence integrity before anything's confirmed. But a silence like that, in 2026, does not stay empty. Within hours, other people start filling it, because the audience wants an answer faster than the actual process can produce one. The people filling that silence generally fall into a few recognizable categories, and it's worth understanding each one, because they behave differently and deserve different levels of trust. There are journalists working with named sources and records requests, the NBC News team that obtained a distress call audio, the CBS team that pulled the GPS data through Mississippi's Department of Marine Resources, the Rolling Stone reporters who tracked down the pool photos' actual metadata. Their work is checkable. You can trace it back to a specific document, a specific recording, a specific on-the-record source. There are legal teams operating in parallel to law enforcement, Ben Crump's office, the additional attorneys who've since joined, in some cases investigators with law enforcement backgrounds working independently. Their information is generally more reliable than pure speculation because it's tied to an actual legal strategy with consequences if it's wrong, but also comes with inherent motivation. They represent one side of a case that may eventually go to trial, which means their public statements are also, to some degree, advocacy. And then there's the third category, which is where the vast majority of what you've probably seen about this case actually comes from commentary channels and individual creators, operating with no formal access to the investigation at all, working entirely from screenshots, secondhand claims, and other creators' videos. Some of these creators are careful. They label speculation as speculation. They retract claims when they're wrong. They cite where a piece of information actually came from. Many are not. Many present a claim with exactly the same confident tone, whether it comes from a court filing or from a comment someone left on a live stream an hour earlier. That's not a criticism of true crime content as a format. Obviously, given what channel you're watching this on, it's a specific warning about this case, because the volume of unverified claims attached to it has genuinely outpaced the volume of verified ones, and that ratio matters. When 90% of what's circulating about a case is speculation dressed up with confident language, the 10% that's actually solid gets harder to find, not easier. Even though there's more content than ever, there's a specific mechanic worth naming here, because it explains why corrections almost never travel as far as the original claim. A false or exaggerated claim about a case like this one tends to be more emotionally activating than the correction that follows it. It's more dramatic. It fits a more satisfying narrative, and it usually gets posted first, while the correction requires someone to do actual verification work, which takes time the original claim never waited for. By the time Rolling Stone had traced the pool photo back to June 27th, the original version, Nolan seen alive after Horn Island, had already reached, by some estimates, close to 1 million views. The correction reached a fraction of that. This is not unique to this case. It's simply how misinformation spreads faster than fact-checking, in every case where it happens, and true crime cases are especially vulnerable to it because emotional stakes are already so high before anyone's even checked a single source. We'd be doing this case a disservice if we didn't address this part directly, because it's been a significant part of the public conversation from the beginning, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. Nolan Wells was, by most accounts and photos from that day, the only black person, or one of very few, in the larger group on Horn Island. Reverend Al Sharpton and Ben Crump have both raised this as part of the broader context of the case, not as a claim that race caused his death, but as part of why the family felt an independent investigation, an independent autopsy, and sustained public pressure were necessary. Sharpton was specific about this distinction at one press conference, saying the family was not bringing race into this, but also not discounting it either. That a careful, deliberate line, and it's worth preserving rather than flattening into something simpler. Here's what's fair to say plainly. A family's decision to question whether an investigation is being handled with the same urgency it will receive under different circumstances is not, on its own, an accusation against any specific person. It's a question about institutional trust, shaped by documented history in the region and across the country. That question deserves to be taken seriously, without requiring anyone to accept improving claims about specific individuals as a condition of taking it seriously. Here's what also fair to say. None of the currently available evidence, the GPS data, the distress call, the mutual phone inspection agreement, the witness statements, identifies any specific person as having caused Nolan's death. Speculation online that names specific individuals as killers, without evidence to support that claim, is not investigative journalism. It's exactly the kind of thing that can derail a real investigation and cause real harm to people who may be entirely innocent of anything beyond being present that day. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and a responsible video about this case has to hold both without collapsing one into the other. This is exactly the kind of case where it's easy to lose the thread between legitimate scrutiny and unfounded accusation, and that's precisely why we go slow with these stories instead of chasing whatever's trending that hour. If you want documentaries built that way, subscribing genuinely helps more people find channels doing it right instead of the fastest possible upload. We'd appreciate it. Let's be specific about what's actually missing, because vague uncertainty isn't useful to anyone. Here is what remains genuinely, legitimately unresolved in the Nolan Wells case as of this recording. Both the state's official autopsy and the family's independent autopsy, conducted in Washington, D.C. and funded in part by Colin Kaepernick, remain unreleased. The state autopsy is reportedly still waiting on toxicology results, which can take weeks depending on lab capacity. Until either report is released, any claim about how Nolan died, including claims that he simply drowned and claims that something more sinister occurred, is not yet supported by released medical evidence. Between roughly 3 o'clock, when Nolan was last confirmed seen, and 4:31 p.m., when GPS data confirms the boat departed the island, there is no independently verified account of what happened. Everything from that window currently comes from members of the same friend group, and their accounts contain at least one direct contradiction that has not been resolved. The mutual inspection has been agreed to, but, as of the most recent public updates, had not yet produced release findings. Whatever is or isn't on that device, the Snapchat activity Christine says was missing, the messages, the location history, has not been confirmed publicly by either side. According to Mississippi Today, many young people who were on Horn Island that day have not come forward, reportedly out of fear of becoming targets themselves. A fear that Trayson Shepard's experience with death threats does nothing to discourage. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has publicly asked anyone with unedited photos, video, or first-hand knowledge from that day to come forward. Once the sheriff's investigation concludes, the case moves to a grand jury. Whether that results in an indictment against anyone for anything remains entirely unknown, and grand jury proceedings themselves are legally confidential, meaning even the process of getting there will happen mostly out of public view. This is what an honest accounting of what we don't know yet actually looks like. It's not a cliffhanger built for engagement. It's the genuine current state of an active investigation. A lot of the online debate in this case comes from a basic misunderstanding of how medical examiners actually determine a cause of death. So let's walk through it properly, because it explains why 2 separate autopsies can take this long, and why that delay is not by itself suspicious. When a body is recovered from water, a medical examiner isn't just checking for water in the lungs. Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion in forensic pathology, meaning the pathologist has to rule out other possible causes of death before drowning can be confirmed as the actual mechanism, rather than simply the location where a body ended up. A person can die of a heart attack, a head injury, a drug overdose, or strangulation, and then end up in the water afterward. Water in the lungs can occur in drowning deaths, but it can also occur passively after death from another cause, since the submerged body will take on water regardless of how the person died. This is exactly why you just check the lungs and you know claims circulating online are an oversimplification of a process that's actually built around ruling things out, not confirming one simple test result. That's where toxicology comes in. And it's also the single biggest reason both autopsies, in this case, have taken weeks rather than days. A full toxicology screen test for a wide range of substances, alcohol, prescription and illicit drugs, and in some cases, substances that require more specialized, slower lab processes to detect. State crime labs are frequently backlogged, and a case doesn't get moved to front of the line just because it has national attention attached to it. That's frustrating for a grieving family. It is not, on its own, evidence of a cover-up. There's also the question of what a body's condition after several days in Gulf water actually allows a pathologist to determine. Time and water affect a body in ways that can complicate identifying bruising, internal injuries, or other signs that might indicate what happened before death. This is part of why an independent second autopsy, conducted by a pathologist with no ties to Mississippi, which is what Nolan's family arranged in Washington, D.C., can be valuable. It gives the family a second set of trained eyes working independently from the state's own examiner, checking the same body for the same categories of evidence, with no institutional relationship to the local investigation. Now let's talk about what a grand jury actually is, because this term gets thrown around online as though it's synonymous with an arrest, and it isn't. A grand jury is not a trial. There's no defense attorney present. There's no judge presiding over an adversarial proceeding the way you'd see on television. It is a group of ordinary citizens, in Mississippi, typically somewhere between 15 and 25 people, who are shown evidence by a prosecutor and asked one question. Is there enough evidence here to support formally charging someone with a crime? That's it. They don't determine guilt. They don't hear from the defense, because in a grand jury proceeding, there technically isn't one yet. If the panel decides there's enough evidence, they issue what's called an indictment, and the case moves toward an actual criminal trial, where guilt or innocence would eventually be decided by a totally different jury under totally different rules. Civil rights attorney Tyler Bailey made an important point about this process in his interview with Law and Crime. Prosecutors have what's called prosecutorial discretion. Even after a grand jury referral is confirmed, the district attorney is not legally obligated to move forward with charges. And even if a grand jury does return an indictment, the DA retains discretion over how the case proceeds from there. A grand jury referral is a serious procedural step. It is not a guarantee of anything in either direction. It's also worth understanding why a grand jury referral is standard procedure for any death classified as unnatural or suspicious in Jackson County, according to the DA's own office. Meaning this step, on its own, doesn't necessarily represent an escalation beyond what any similarly unresolved death would receive. What would represent an escalation is what the grand jury is ultimately shown and what they decide to do with it. That's the part nobody outside the proceeding will know until it's over. Because grand jury sessions are, by law, confidential. No media coverage. No public transcript. Not even Ben Crump, as the family's attorney, is permitted inside the room. That confidentiality is exactly why so much public attention has shifted toward the pieces of evidence that can be discussed openly. The phone, the GPS data, the distress call, because those are threads the public actually gets to follow in real time, while the grand jury process itself happens entirely out of view. If you spent any time in the comment sections around this case, you've probably seen it compared to other names, other young people who went missing or died under circumstances a family and community found difficult to accept at face value. That comparison isn't accidental, and it's worth addressing directly, because it explains a lot about why this case escalated the way it did. Cases like this tend to follow a recognizable pattern once they reach a certain level of public attention. First, there's an initial statement from local law enforcement, often made before a full investigation is complete, that frames the death as an accident or as lacking evidence of a crime. Second, the family, often working with legal counsel, raises specific factual inconsistencies that the initial statement didn't account for: a missing report, contradictory witness accounts, evidence that didn't come back through normal channels. Third, that combination of an early, seemingly premature conclusion and a set of unresolved contradictions creates space for public distrust to grow, and that distrust gets filled, often within days, by online speculation that moves far faster than any actual investigation possibly could. The important distinction in every case that follows this pattern is between the legitimate factual inconsistencies, the kind that a grand jury, a toxicology report, or forensic phone examination can actually resolve, and the speculative theories that grow up around them, which usually cannot be resolved by anyone, because they were never built on evidence to begin with. A tampering with evidence charge, for example, is a fundamentally different legal category from a homicide charge. It means someone allegedly concealed or altered evidence, not that they caused a death. Conflating the two, or assuming one automatically implies the other, is one of the most common ways online discussion of cases like this gets ahead of what's actually been established. We've made a point of keeping those categories separate throughout this video for exactly that reason. Since a lot of you have asked variations of the same questions in comments on our previous coverage of developing cases, let's address the most common misconceptions directly. If it was an accident, why would anyone hide anything? Panic and guilt are not the same thing, and they don't always produce the same behavior. People who have done nothing wrong sometimes still behave in ways that look suspicious after a traumatic event. Leaving a scene, failing to call someone immediately, giving inconsistent accounts under stress. That's a documented phenomenon in trauma psychology, not a defense of anyone's specific actions in this case. It simply means that behavior alone, without corroborating physical evidence, is not proof of wrongdoing. It's a reason to ask more questions, not a reason to reach a conclusion. Why hasn't anyone been arrested if there's this much smoke? Because an arrest requires probable cause tied to an actual charge, and probable cause has to be built on evidence that will hold up when tested, not on public suspicion, however widespread. Right now, the toxicology results aren't in, the phone hasn't been fully examined by both sides, and the grand jury process hasn't concluded. An arrest made before that foundation exists would be far more likely to collapse later than one built on completed forensic work. Doesn't the family retrieving evidence themselves prove the sheriff's department did something wrong? Not necessarily, though it does raise legitimate questions about the pace and thoroughness of the initial response. Families are not always kept as informed as they should be during an active investigation, particularly in smaller jurisdictions without extensive resources for a case of this scale. That's a real and valid criticism of process. It is not, by itself, evidence of an intentional cover-up. Is this case actually going anywhere, or will it just fade out like people worry it will? That's the most honest question of all, and we don't have a certain answer. What we can tell you is that the mutual phone inspection agreement, the grand jury referral, and the ongoing involvement of legal teams with genuine resources behind them all represent forward motion that a huge number of cases like this never get. Whether that motion ultimately produces answers a family can live with is something only time, and the actual evidence will determine. There's a legal wrinkle buried inside the mutual phone inspection agreement that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention, and it's worth walking through, because it could matter enormously if this case ever reaches an actual trial. For weeks, Nolan's phone was in the possession of the family's own independent investigators, not law enforcement. The family recovered it themselves, using the Life 360 tracking app, from the location where it had been left by one of Nolan's friends. That means, for a meaningful stretch of time, the single most contested piece of digital evidence in this entire case sat outside the direct chain of custody that a criminal investigation would normally require. Tyler Bailey, the civil rights and criminal defense attorney who spoke with Law and Crime about this case, addressed exactly this problem. Multiple people having handled a piece of evidence before it's formally logged into an official investigation can become a real issue if the case ever goes to trial. A defense attorney representing anyone eventually charged in connection with this case could argue that the evidence should be excluded, or at least that its reliability should be seriously questioned, specifically because of that gap in custody. Here's the counterargument, and it's a reasonable one. Unlike physical evidence, a weapon, a piece of clothing, digital evidence carries its own internal record keeping. Metadata, timestamps, and deletion logs exist independently of who is physically holding the phone, and a properly conducted forensic extraction can often show what was accessed, when and by whom, even after the fact. That's part of why the mutual inspection agreement matters as much as it does. Having both the family forensic experts and law enforcement's experts present simultaneously, watching the same extraction happen in real time. creates a shared, mutually witnessed record of exactly what the phone contained at the moment of examination, regardless of what happened to the device beforehand. It doesn't erase the earlier chain of custody gap, but it does mean that from this point forward, neither side can credibly claim the other altered or selectively presented what was found. This is also, procedurally, part why Bailey described a mutual inspection arrangement itself as highly unusual. It is not standard practice for a victim's family to be granted direct, simultaneous access to a forensic examination alongside law enforcement. That level of access typically only happens when there's already significant public pressure and a documented breakdown of trust between the family and the investigating agency, which is exactly what occurred here, given the family's account receiving almost no direct communication from the sheriff's department for well over a week during an active investigation into their son's death. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, the press conferences, the subpoenas, the viral photo that turned out to be from the wrong day, Christine and Elmore Wansley also had to plan their son's funeral, and they made a deliberate choice about how to do it that's worth including here, because it says something about who Nolan was to the people who actually knew him. The service was held at Centerpoint Church in Ocean Springs, with visitation beginning at 9 in the morning followed immediately by the service. Reverend Al Sharpton officiated, at the family's request. Filmmaker Tyler Perry covered the full cost of the funeral. Colin Kaepernick helped fund the independent autopsy in Washington, D.C. afterward. The family held what they specifically chose to call a celebration of life at the Jackson County Fairgrounds, rather than a traditional repast. Christine explained that choice directly. Nolan, she said, would not want everyone sitting around crying in silence. He would want a party. She opened the celebration to former teammates, coaches, classmates from every level he played at, and, notably, to media as well. She let cameras into her son's funeral on purpose, at a moment when she still didn't have an official cause of death, still didn't have the incident report she was legally entitled to, and was actively fighting to keep national attention on a case she worried would otherwise quietly fade. That's not a detail that resolves any of the open questions in this case, but it tells you something true about the family at the center of it. They have not, at any point in this process, retreated from public scrutiny. They've invited it repeatedly, specifically because they believe visibility is what keeps an investigation honest. Whether or not you agree with every claim that circulated around this case, that specific choice to let the cameras on the worst day of their lives because they didn't trust the alternative deserves to be understood on its own terms. Out of everything we just laid out, the missing 40 minutes, the phone data, the 2 autopsies, the witnesses who haven't come forward, tell me which one you think is most likely to actually break this case open. Type phone, window, or autopsy in the comments, whichever you think matters most. I read every single one, and I want to know where the audience's instincts land compared to where the actual investigators seem to be focusing. Let's close the loop with a clean summary, because after everything we've covered, it's worth having one place where the facts are simply sorted by category. Confirmed, Nolan Wells, 18, traveled to Horn Island on July 4th with a group of friends. He was last seen around 3 p.m. near the island's northwest tip. His friends both developed a mechanical failure and departed the island at 4:31 p.m., according to GPS data. Nolan did not return with them. A distress call to a towing service was placed and later obtained by NBC News. His body was recovered on July 6th and identified through dental records. His phone and car keys were recovered from friends rather than with him. The Jackson County District Attorney has confirmed the case will go to a grand jury once the sheriff's investigation concludes. A mutual, simultaneous forensic inspection of Nolan's phone has been agreed to by both the family and law enforcement. Disputed whether Nolan told friends he was staying behind or whether Katie's account, that he said he was heading back to the boat, is accurate, whether the clothing described in police reports matches what he was actually wearing, whether the Snapchat account being empty reflects deleted content or an unrelated explanation. Whose account of that afternoon holds up once fully cross-examined. Unknown, the official cause and manner of death, pending both autopsy results. What happened during the roughly 90-minute window between Nolan's last sighting and the boat's departure. What is actually contained in the phone data? Whether any additional witnesses will come forward? Whether a grand jury will ultimately return any indictment? And if so, against whom? For what? False and confirmed false. The claim that the June 27th pool photo depicted Nolan alive after Horn Island. The photo predates his disappearance by 8 days. The claim that the viral argument audio featured Nolan's voice. The person in that recording, Trayston Shepard, has identified himself on the record with 2 separate outlets. That's the whole picture as it stands right now, with nothing added and nothing softened. Before we close this one out, this channel only works if people who care about getting cases like this right decide to stick around for the next one. We're not chasing whatever's trending by the hour. We're following the specific family's fight for answers for as long as it takes to get them. If that's worth your subscription, we genuinely appreciate it. It's worth ending where we started, because it's the easiest thing to lose in a case this complicated. Somewhere underneath the GPS data, the mutual phone inspection, the grand jury referral, the pool photo that turned out to be from a different day entirely, is an 18-year-old who told his mother he loved her on his way out the door and never came home. A kid who friends described as the one who never met a stranger. A wide receiver with a season still ahead of him. A son who asked his mom to snap one more photo before bed, on ordinary nights, for no reason other than wanting the moment recorded. Christine Wansley has spent the week since his death doing something no parent should have to do, fact-checking her own son's death investigation in public, correcting false claims about her family in real time, planning a funeral while simultaneously fighting for a police report she is legally entitled to receive within 72 hours and did not get for far longer than that. In one recorded message to supporters, she described grief as multi-layered. One moment able to talk about her son's stories, the next feeling like there's an elephant sitting on her chest. That is what this case actually is underneath every headline. Not a mystery to be solved for entertainment. A family trying to survive the worst thing that has ever happened to them, in front of an audience that sometimes forgets they're watching real people. Whatever the autopsy eventually shows, whatever the phone data reveals, whatever a grand jury eventually decides, Nolan Wells is a person before he was a case, and he deserves an investigation built on verified evidence, not a comment section verdict built on a photo from the wrong day and a voice that was never his. If this case develops, new autopsy results, the phone inspection findings, any grand jury movement, we will be back with a fully verified update, and only a verified update. If you want to be here when that happens, subscribing is genuinely the only way to make sure you don't miss it, since we're not going to chase this story with a dozen speculative uploads between now and then. Let us know in the comments which unresolved piece of this case you'll be watching for most closely, the phone, the autopsy, or the missing 40 minutes.